Good afternoon, Nashater. How are you?
Hello, Ninder. I'm delighted to be with you here. Yes, great. Thanks. How about you?
Yeah, my opening comment first was, we're in the same continent. And then I realized you're in Norway, so you're an hour ahead. Because I've spoke to a lot of people from America, different parts of America, and of course the UK. But I haven't spoken to them from Scandinavia. Although, as my band, Johal, that I perform with, we have been to that part neck of the woods. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Before I kick off and talk about your fantastic book, Leadership Pin Code, what was interesting was that you and I met, and you're going to have to forgive me, I've said this with a few other people, but there's a bit of a difference here. You and I met on Clubhouse.
That's right.
But we had a connection, unlike with some of the others, is that actually we both grew up in the Black Country.
You know, the moment I heard your accent on Clubhouse, right. It's funny because, you know, Clubhouse is just a still image. That's and right. I heard your accent and I knew exactly where you were from. And that's when I reached out to you, wasn't it? And I said, yeah. I think we're both from the Black Country, would love to connect with you, because it's just for me, a very distinctive accent and takes me straight home. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what led us. And then, of course, right. I quickly checked your Clubhouse profile. I thought, wow, actually, she's done rather well for herself. So I think
likewise.
I think I have to go back to Nashater and say, look, I think there's some interesting stuff. So you've now, so you left these shores, you went into Scandinavia, you've written a book. So just before we go into the book, you're a psychologist, you've done TEDx talks, you've done all kinds of stuff. What led you to the book? And that might help you describe what you were doing that led you to the book.
You know, the book came about because I was working as a coach, working with leaders in business, and that there's a story to how I ended up doing that. But essentially, I really believed in the skills that I'm coaching in. And as I started to coach people in that, leaders in that approach, they would ask me, as they would, you know, have you written this down anywhere? Where can we go back and look at this? And I was thinking, well, I haven't really written it down because it's just from my experience of working with different groups and as a psychologist. So I would send them PowerPoint slides, you know, or little Word documents with my thoughts into that. And it was only after a little while I thought, probably a good idea if I do start to put it into some kind of written format. And I'm not a writer, and I'd never imagined I would be a writer. So I actually then approached a few publishers and said, you know, if I was going to put this into a book, how could I do that? Yeah, that's how the book came back. And it really came about as a book for clients. It wasn't something I was writing to tell the world about what I do. It was really a manual for the clients I was working with and helping them to use the methods I was coaching them with.
So let's go back a step. You said you were coaching, you talk about clients. You're a psychologist, is that right?
That's right. I'm a trained psychologist in background, clinical forensic psychologist.
So when you say you go to coach, I mean, you tend to listen, if someone says clinical psychologist, it means I've lost a few marbles or something. So you know, that's the perception. But
it puts the fear of God into a lot of people, doesn't it?
Yeah. But you're going into businesses. So what are you advising them on? And then we'll go into the book.
So, you know, a lot of coaching is really about, well, coaching is about helping people achieve the goals that they have, or helping them to identify those goals and then using skills to be able to help them to get there. And that's essentially what I was doing as a psychologist. I was helping people. In that case, it was people with mental health problems or challenges, and helping them to find ways, using the skills I had, find ways of improving their life or improving their well-being or reaching their goals, whatever they were, in a health setting. And now I was using those same skills, connecting with people, building trust, you know, establishing rapport and helping them to achieve their goals in a business setting. So I use a lot of the psychology that I've learned in other settings now in coaching. So there's a huge overlap for me in those skills.
Okay, so now to the book, and it's called The Leadership Pin Code, and we'll go into the pin in a few minutes as well. But you basically say that there are three elements that you need to conquer. One is your approach. And I don't want to do too much of it because otherwise people will hear it all, they won't buy the book. So we'll have to be we'll have to be quite careful. So, A for approach, B for behavior, and C for conversation. Now, I mean, you can take whichever one. The B one really I found interesting, the behavior, and how you approach and talk to people irrespective actually whether you're a new leader and old leader. Why did you pick the A, B, and C? And do you want to tackle the B and then maybe go a little bit of the C as well?
B for body language and behavior, that's what it refers to. And it's really about that part of us that maybe we're not always aware of, that is part of our communication. We're using words all the time and speaking as you and I are now, but we're also communicating in our eye contact, in our facial expressions, in our use of our arms and other parts of our bodies. So it was really to make sure that because essentially the book is about how we build relationships and how we build those connections with people. And we need to take care of all the parts of communication that we have, not just the words that we use and the statements that we make or questions that we ask, but how that is showing up in our body language. And what research will tell you, Ninder, actually, is that the impact of your body language is the greater part of your communication with somebody compared to your words. In some cases, I think the research suggests it's almost 80 to 90% of the impact is actually how you say things, not what you say. Isn't that interesting? So I really wanted to make sure when I'm talking to leaders that we take care of that part of it, which is so significant.
And okay, so let's go step. Let's look at that quite carefully. So are we suggesting then that leaders who go into a leadership role, let's take entrepreneurs for an example. So they lack the self-awareness to understand what their body language says, and some will probably don't realize that actually their body language is said it before they've opened their mouth. Is that right? And if that's the case, don't we learn through life that if there's some obvious signals we all learn from watching other people, an angry face, cross face, arms folded. Do we need to, don't people know that? I mean, don't people generally know that common sense? Well, have I got it wrong?
Well, isn't it a great question? Because you think that we'd either know ourselves because we know ourselves,
that's right,
or that people around us who know us would just tell us. But I'm sure you've had the experience, I certainly have, where you found yourself on a video, you've been to an event and you've seen yourself on video and caught yourself doing things, I didn't know I did that. And nobody points it out, because we don't actually, as humans, go around pointing out each other's mannerisms and behaviors. It's quite a personal thing to do, isn't it? It can feel you might be quite sensitive to that. So I don't know that we all have that insight. And actually, the more and more I've worked with leaders, it's just reminded me that it's human nature not to know ourselves 100% well. There are things that we do that we don't know we do. And people around us are perhaps going to be kind enough not to point all of them out all the time. That would make us a little bit neurotic, wouldn't it? So I don't know that we do know all of those things. And I think in a business setting, which is what I wrote the book for, it's really important when you're trying to communicate with people to get them to perform, that you're aware of that. You're aware of some of the things that, maybe you're not, maybe making the message that you're trying to communicate more effective, or maybe getting in your way. That could be helpful for you to know. So that's what I was trying to work on and point out.
Let me pick something you said. Just picking that up, because you're talking about body language and how you come across. You said, I'm trying to find the line now. You said, oh yeah, here it is. You say first impressions don't count. So I'm taking this body language thing now. Now, Malcolm Gladwell says the complete reverse. He says those first 2-3 seconds can form an opinion of someone, and it's very difficult to get that back. So which is the right one? Because you do say first impressions don't count.
So and it's a great, I get asked this a lot, and I think what's important to distinguish here is what's the impact that you're trying to have. And I'm talking about having influence, the ability to actually impact somebody to the point where you're able to create a mutual understanding and have an influence with each other, right? Make something happen. When we talk about first impressions, it's those first 3 seconds. They're not necessarily influential. They'll have an effect on me. I'll make a judgment about you based on those 3 seconds. It's probably not going to be very accurate. As humans, we're not very good at first impressions, actually. We tend to bring a lot of our own biases to those first 3 seconds. I'll make a lot of judgments about what I see and what I hear that are based on my experiences and might have no truth whatsoever in the reality of what you're doing. But for influence, we need to go past those 3 seconds. We need to learn the person beyond that time frame. So what I mean by that is don't use first impressions as a way or a basis for having influence with somebody else, believing that that is enough for you to understand them, know them, and then be able to work with them. Influence lasts longer. When we learn people and we understand that we're more likely to be able to have positive impact than those first 3 seconds.
You're a new leader, and the first thing people do and say, and I'm picking up your impressions here, this is my 100-day plan, they say. This is what I'm going to do. They do it without knowing anyone, without having walked around, asked people what they think. They've looked at spreadsheets, they've looked at balance sheets, and they've gone for it. What's your advice to a new leader when they walk into an environment? And a new leader, not in a sense, well, they could be the first time they're in a leadership role,
Right.
but it also could be they've walked into a new place for the first time. What should they be doing to have that positive impact you're talking about and that positive impression, whilst knowing they're under this pressure to deliver this vision and this tactical plan for the next 100 days?
You know, when new leaders come in, whether they're first time or new to the organization, they often are coming in with some kind of change agenda, you know, something they want to revitalize, change completely, have some kind of impact on. And what you see is those who come in and who race in and just impose those changes because they believe them to be true. They may well have an impact. Well, they will have an impact. Whether they'll have a positive impact or not will be needed to be proven. But what we see is that leaders who take the time to understand the organization and take them with them on that journey by explaining, this is the reason I want to make these changes, or I think these changes are important. More importantly, the leaders who are most effective are the ones who harness information. They learn their organization. They take the time to understand what's been here before I turned up, what's important to take with us into the change, and what's important to leave behind. And you can only do that through connecting with your organization, speaking to them, understanding them, and then communicating why the changes you want to make are so important. Actually, even testing out whether they're still relevant might be important. So I would say that the most effective new leaders are those who take the time to learn their organization and then introduce the change with a good understanding and explanation of why that change is so necessary. They'll have much more of an engaged organization that wants to follow them on that journey afterwards.
I mean, we'll go into conversation you'll see in a second, but let me just pick that up again then, because they walk in, I think they should take their time. They should try to understand what's going on, but there are pressures from the stakeholders. In there, when you talk about body language, you do talk about how you should be dressed, how you should dress. And there's a reason I'm asking this question, because I've seen a gradual change. I don't know about Scandinavia. Well, I think I can guess what Scandinavia get up to. But how important is that, the way you dress? Because it's getting back to your body language, your behavior. How important is it, do you think, the way people dress? And I say, if somebody never wears a tie, and people do look at me sometimes, not.
You know, let's first of all just be clear about what we mean by dress code or what we dress. It can be anything. I'm not talking about, for example, that, you know, it needs to be a suit and tie, or it needs to be anything particular, but it's understanding that what people see when we communicate with them is also what we're wearing. And if we think about, you know, I refer to this in the book, dress code is used to communicate in many parts of our lives. You know, we see the police wearing a uniform. Now, part of that uniform has a protective nature and it's got equipment attached to it, but part of it is the signal effect that, you know, you know who we are and what we do, and it tells you through that dress code what you can expect of us. And the colors that are used and the materials that are used, they're all also part of the communication of power and mandate. When we think about going into an interview situation, we tend to dress for the interview, don't we? It might be if you're going into a job where it's very, very casual. You know, the environment that you're walking into expects people to just be in jeans and t-shirts, that you'd mirror that. You'd go in dressed and not overdressed. On the other hand, if you're going into a law firm, for example, and you know that they like, or they seem to, you've done your research, you can tell that they're very much into, you know, dark suits and white shirts and ties. Well, you would mirror that and dress accordingly. So my message really is, think about the impact that you want to have, and think about whether it's helpful or not helpful to try and mirror in your dress code the impact that you want to have. So turning up to an interview, for example, where your interview panel are all going to be very, very suited and formal, and it's a very conservative environment, it's probably a good idea to think about how that's going to show up for you in the way that you dress, and not turn up in your evening clothes where you'd be going for a glass of wine with your friends and very, evening and casual, for example. So it's just to be very conscious. To your question, I think it's very important. I think people would like it not to be. I certainly get a lot of pushback from people saying, it shouldn't matter. I should be able to be exactly the way I want to be. And I say, yes, I agree with you. Human nature will also tell you that people will interpret the way you communicate through the way you dress. And people do. We use dress code to express ourselves. Some people love to be, very colourful and radically different to their norm where they live, and other people like to blend in. We're trying to communicate something either way.
So how you dress does indicate your behavior.
It will, I don't know if it indicates your behavior, but how you dress will be a part of the behavior that you're communicating with. Yeah.
Got it. Moving on to conversation, this is interesting. So tell us a bit about the conversation, then I've got a couple of questions to ask you around. So what did you mean by, we've gone into behavior, body language and how you dress and sort of all that. So what do you mean by conversation? Because this, I think, is really huge.
So the ABC, your approach, which is how you prepare your mindset, or the research that you do with people, is the biggest part of getting prepared for a conversation that you're going to have with somebody.
That's right.
And then I talk about the body language that will be the non-verbal part of that, the things you maybe need to be aware of that will add to your message. And when we get to the C, which is the conversation, that's really the words you're going to use. And we know the power of words, right? We know, for example, that, asking very direct, blunt questions might create defensiveness in some people. We talk a lot in coaching about using open questions that help people to share more and feel more comfortable and give you more data. So the C is really the art of questioning and responses and timing that I learned as a psychologist, building rapport with some very difficult and challenging people. Very much the toolkit that I was trained in is what I'm sharing in the ABC, and conversation is a part of that. So I share with my audience in the book some of the questioning types and techniques I was trained in that can help you connect and build trust, give you more information, help you to go deeper with the person that you're trying to build a rapport with.
So would you say that you've now picked up the approach? Let's just pick that up. So most things that go wrong are the lack of planning before you have a conversation. Is that right?
I would say so.
You haven't planned for that conversation. Because you haven't planned for it, you haven't worked out the outcomes. And because you haven't planned for it, you haven't thought about what the other person thinks. And because you haven't planned for it, you haven't planned for a set of scenarios that might come at the end and know how to prepare for them. Right. Is that about right? Is that about right?
That captures it very well. It's very much about thinking ahead of time, particularly if it's going to be a tricky conversation. You're going into maybe somebody who's in conflict with you, or is likely to show some kind of emotional reaction to what you need to talk about. In a work environment, that can be a leader giving, poor performance feedback to somebody, or, they've got a disagreement, difference of opinion, and they can't find common ground. So thinking ahead of time, what questions would be helpful so that I don't make the matters worse, so that we try and find our common ground? What kind of setting do I need to create with the tone of voice I use? That's also part of conversation. How will I show that I am collaborating, that I'm sympathizing or empathizing with this person, so that we have a chance of this working out well? And thinking through the questions and thinking through the sequence of those responses can be very helpful. If we're very impulsive, we don't plan and we go into those, it means that what we often see is that people allow their emotions to get in the way, and they say and do things that make things perhaps worse.
So here's a question then. So just taking that into account, that planning, that understanding, is that better for or more suited to introverts than extroverts? Because introverts tend to shoot from the hip, don't they?
Introverts, did you say?
Extroverts.
Oh, extroverts. Sorry, I was going to say, okay.
Tend to shoot from the hip, whereas introverts tend to be a lot more methodical, both in their approach and the way they talk, and it's very deliberate. Is that, am I just making
I
generalizations.
mean, there's a whole other area of psychology about introversion and extroversion. And when we talk about it in the lay person context, we often overgeneralize what extroverts and introverts are and what they do and who they are. And actually, there's a lot of nuances to that. But what I would say is that if we stick to the generalization and we don't get into exactly all the details of what might make them also very similar, is that people who have an introvert way of processing, that's what I refer to it as rather than personality, that they like to think before they speak. They like to take in information and think about it before they come with a response, are more likely then to do that careful planning before they respond than perhaps somebody who processes in an extrovert way, meaning they get information and the first thing they want to do is discuss it with somebody else, want to share that thought out loud because they do their sense making with other people, whereas the introvert processors prefer to do that work themselves before they share. So there may be some truth in there. I wouldn't go all the way to say that it makes, you know, one group better or worse than the others, because then personality comes into it and you know, their experiences comes into it. So there's many more things that impact the way we express ourselves than introversion, extroversion.
The reason why I asked that question around leadership is people judge it in those stark terms. They tend to think as a leader, we need somebody outlandish, somebody really on the front foot, somebody goes for it. But unfortunately, the problem is they're not going to have that approach you're suggesting in the book, which is a lot of planning and getting yourself ready. And when, you know, we have a recession or when there's a real big problem around business and people start to look, well, who's in charge? And when they look at the extroverts, they say, well, you know, that's the problem. We should have had introverts in. So it's just interesting. And the reason I asked that question is because some people try to change their very being because they think the trend is for an extrovert. So I'm going to have to act like an extrovert, even though actually I'm a lot more. And really, it's that really when you look at leadership and appointment, recruitment, and you can see what people are looking for. And politics is very much now driven by personality than competence.
So what we're looking for in leadership, when I think about it from the research and theoretical perspective, and what we're seeing in terms of what is effective leadership, there's a lot of research actually to show that people who are, let's say whatever introvert is, more introverted, are as effective leaders, if not sometimes more effective leaders than people who are very outgoing or showing more extrovert traits. Now, my view on this is it's much more to do with the individual than these gross generalizations. I've seen very effective, seemingly extrovert leaders do a great job of engaging, building enthusiasm, inspiring, motivating organizations towards goals and changes. But I've also seen seemingly introverted leaders have that same effect, but through different ways, because it's not just about those parts of who they are. It's how they communicate. It's their passions for what they do. You can have introvert style leaders who are incredibly passionate about what they do, but it just shows up differently. But yet they're able to take their audience with them because they are communicating in a way that helps people to understand the importance of it. And extrovert leaders can do the same. So I don't buy into the whole idea that that's enough to decide in your recruitment strategy whether a leader is the right leader or not, that you go with introvert versus extrovert. I think there's far more to it than that.
I'll tell you what I've been leading to. It's my next question, which is, I think, the killer question. And I've been leading to it. And that's just what that sort of context is. Now, I was amazed when I saw your TED talk on psychopaths. I thought, good grief.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So the question then is, so you've written about the role of, and this is really interesting, fantasy.
Right.
And how it plays in leadership. And that's why I wanted to get that context set now. So we've worked out extroverts, introverts, and planning and behavior and conversation. So now let's look at what plays behind all of this is fantasy. Now, we hear about crime, premeditated crime, and what drives these people to do what they do. And it's that fantasy they want to, you know, so how does that break that down into business? I mean, do leaders have that? And are they driven by that? And what does that look like? And can we extrapolate from crime?
Absolutely. So let me tell you how I extrapolate from my work with working with people who are classified as psychopaths to how I've encouraged fantasizing in leaders. So my background in working with offenders in maximum security, one of the roles I had was to look at, how do they plan their offences? What processes are they using to, think about organised crime. There's a lot of planning, a lot of TV programs and films based on this too, where we see a lot of planning is required to kind of, if we're going to rob the bank, we need to spend weeks figuring out how we're going to get past the security and the alarm and when are the shifts and when there's less people or more people. All that planning there's a physicality to that planning. We sit down and we map things out. But one of the things I learned in studying offenders was that those who were very premeditated tended to have very imaginative processes, fantasy processes, where they actually imagined, if I do this, then what might happen, step by step, drawing out in a visual way in their minds, a little movie, if you like, of what it is that they wanted to achieve. And in doing so, they would be using fantasy as a way of testing out scenarios, risk scenarios. Well, if I do this, what might happen? If we go at 10 o'clock in the morning, that might be too busy. If we, don't know when the shifts are for the security guards, we might find ourselves, coming across one of them. So they tested out these scenarios, and we called it the snowball effect of the fantasy. So you start with a simple idea, I want to rob a bank. And then you start to imagine, getting up in the morning, getting dressed, where are you going to take the car, where are you going to park? And it snowballs into a bigger and bigger movie, right? So we all do this, actually. If you think about, again, let's use the interview as a scenario. You're going to an interview for a job. You imagine yourself in the room. Those of us who really want to be well prepared, we might picture ourselves walking into the room. How do I want to dress? Back to our dress code conversation. How am I going to sit? Shall I take a notepad with me and a pencil or not? How am I going to open with my first question? We play the scenario out in our minds. And the whole purpose of fantasy in the offender group was to prepare themselves for the event. Now, the more I studied fantasy, and I did my actual doctorate in that subject on how the neuropsychology of it, where does that process take place in the brain and how does it evolve? What I found was that those people who use fantasy to prepare tended to be better at executing their plans. Wow. Because they were really working through some of the problems that might occur. They were able to think about, if this, then what? So they were sequencing the event. They were using their imagination, their fantasy to make plans, and then they had a better chance of executing that plan than if somebody impulsively ran into the bank and tried to pull off the heist. So when I looked at, and I started to coach leaders, I found that those leaders, and I was watching very successful leaders, very effective leaders, and I studied them, and I would talk to them, and I'd find that they weren't calling it fantasizing, but they were imagining scenarios. They were working through beforehand, visualizing themselves going on to give a presentation on a stage. They would mentally rehearse that in detail and then go ahead and execute it. So they more or less knew most of the things they were going to do. That's why it's important for leaders, because what I see is effective leaders use fantasy or imagination, if that's the language I think they would probably use, to rehearse and plan what they need to do. They might do it individually, or they'll do it with a team and create scenarios and visualize scenarios and work through scenarios so that they can execute on their strategies or their priorities. I always say, and it's quite a controversial statement, that some of the offenders I met who were very into planning and premeditation were some of the best strategy executioners I'd ever seen. And, I'm not saying that as in glorifying what they did or saying what they did was right, but the method that they used, until they got caught, managed to get into a very clear plan of execution based on that fantasy process. And I think that's something I see leaders who are very effective able to do. So I think the leaders who struggle with execution have a lot to learn from that, perhaps.
Well, it's interesting. We've only got to hear the word mafia. You just think of mafia, how they've managed to continue as a legacy. And you're right, when you read some of the reports, when people are convicted, then they go into detail on how they did it. I've said this before, one of the best, I did a bit of teaching, and one of the best students was somebody, and I'm not glorifying it, but ran a very successful drug operation. And the detail this guy went through to get the product, sourcing it, getting it cleaned up, finding his customer base,
Right.
distributing, working the margins out. And this was a guy that I was told could never even get what we call a GCSE. This guy numerically was just so unbelievable. So it is interesting that, and of course that I forget his name, the Cuban guy who got locked away around a big empire across loads of activities, lots and lots of activities. And you think, well, he's employing the most amazing management techniques to get across, and you do wonder why these individuals do succeed in what they do. And that's why I was intrigued with the word fantasy, and just seeing what we can learn from people on the other side of the fence is quite extraordinary, really.
I mean, as a psychologist and neuropsychologist at that stage, when I was studying it really from, what's happening in the software of the brain, where is this taking place, and how can we figure out whether we can actually influence it in some way? How can we make people better fantasists for adaptive reasons, not for crime? Then I was thinking more about, how can we use that to help them to think about other ways of living their lives, other ways of improving their circumstances, and certainly in the business environment, how can we use it in a positive way? But it really did bring home to me the importance of thinking through in advance and the power of visualization. Now, Ninder, you've probably come across it. I know I certainly have, of people who use meditation, who use visualization in other parts of their lives to think about, goals that they want to achieve. They think of athletes. I work with a top sports team, as you know, at the moment, a national sports team, and the power of visualization in those sportsmen is very important. Visualizing the game in play, visualizing the goals taking place, visualizing the win as a motivator, but also an opportunity to rehearse how they're going to get there. Super important. So fantasy, I'm really interested in. Of course, it was interesting working with offenders and seeing how they used it, but I'm really now much more interested in how we use it in everyday life, and how high performers like athletes are able to use it to actually be top of their game.
Let me ask you another question around leadership style then. The example you've just given, and I'm thinking of the Cuban drug baron, they called him. I'm pretty certain, listen, I didn't know him at all, but one would think to run the mafia or something like that, you need a very directive style of leadership. Boom, boom, we're going to do this. And of course, if I take football, that used to be very directive. So all the coaches were people who could shout, people would coerce, halftime, throw bottles around, screaming at people. But of course, football has changed. It's become more of a coach. You don't call them football managers anymore. You call them coaches. And they use a lot more EQ, understand each individual. So how do you balance the two? How do you get someone? I mean, we all agree that in crime, you take certain bits. In other words, forget the directive, but understand the imaging. Just wondering how you balance that. And do you think EQ is now here to stay, and directive coaching, the way that the mafia works, that's now gone and it'll never ever return? And it can only maybe exist in a legal crime?
You know what I was going to mention when we were talking about, the organized crime, the leadership, if we're going to call it that, is much more about command and control and fear-based instruction. I wouldn't necessarily, they are leading people, there's no doubt about it. And I'm sure there are willing followers in some parts of those organizations, but a lot of it is based on fear and command and control, not leadership as I would consider to be effective leadership. So let's move then into what is effective leadership. And you're describing it there very much in the sporting world. And there is a move much more now to understanding that coaching, when you're coaching high performers, it's not just about the skill set that you're coaching them in. So if I'm a great footballer myself and now I've become the coaching manager of the team, I might have know exactly how they should play the game. But does that mean I'm an expert in how to communicate that to them? Can I get my message across in that moment, in a high pressured environment when, the game's at its most stressful peak and I've got to shout across because it's, there's distances involved and there's, raging adrenaline. How do I get my messaging across so that the other person can hear it? I think there's been a huge shift over, how long in sports, but certainly in business over the last 20 years, a recognition that knowing your trade is only one part of great leadership. And actually the greater part of leadership is how you communicate. So
That's
being an
your C.
expert in your field is not enough.
And that's your C, that's your conversation.
That's it, that's the C. Well, the B and the C. In fact, I was coaching somebody in sports not so long ago, and we were talking very much about, it's not just racing in to speak. It's being very aware about how you're communicating that non-verbally, going back to my earlier point. More than 70, 80% of what you're saying is showing up in your facial expressions and your tone of voice. The reason a lot of charismatic politicians make it is not because of what they're saying, but they're building an enthusiasm, and their charisma, if you like, is carrying their message further than just the words. So the words are only one part of the message. So I do think EQ is becoming more and more important in leadership across different industries. And I think it's necessary because we're beginning to recognize, and COVID has taught us this, but now we're more remote from each other, physically remote, that talking through a screen demands something else of me as a leader than I'm used to when I could just walk into an office and speak to somebody. I've got to understand how to connect. I have to have that emotional intelligence to know how to speak to people and communicate through this screen, for example.
Do you think, before we go on to your experience at Harvard and negotiation, do you think we should all be trained psychologists to survive? do you think you talking to me, you're at an advantage here because you're looking at my body language, you understand the words I've used? Is this the failing of society that we've not been taught how, your ABC approach, even at school or college, or to say, look, this is in reality how the world works, and for you to get on.
I think it would be terribly boring if we were all the same and we were all learning the same thing. So I'm all for everybody bringing, their own skills and experiences, and mine's just one as a psychologist, and even psychologists are not all the same. I'm very different to another psychologist who studied a different type of psychology. What I will say, and you've really highlighted that, something that's, I believe is very, very important, and particularly in this generation, is this: we need to have focus in schools and in our education system somewhere on encouraging children to demonstrate, and if they don't have the skills for it, learning the skills of empathy. I do believe at the heart of everything, it's not all, there's a lot of skills we could teach children and adults, but I really think if we can start with empathy, the ability to understand somebody else's perspective. And I say it in my TED talk that you watched, empathy doesn't for me mean agreeing with other people, that we need to run around all agreeing with each other. It's about that ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and just understand why they believe what they do, or they mean what they do, or they are understanding why they're behaving the way they are. Because through that understanding, we can then connect with that person and see another perspective. It might change ours, or we might be able to change theirs if we can find that common ground between us. Empathy, I think, is at the heart of it all. That's what I would really be focused on, encouraging them to have more focus on in schools.
Now that follows very nicely onto negotiation, because you've got to understand the other half when you negotiate.
Right.
But is empathy as easy as you say it is? Because sometimes you are so entrenched in the way you think, my way is absolutely correct, and nothing else will budge. You're just completely convinced the other person is totally unreasonable, totally. So that's the first thing. How can you create that self-awareness, particularly if you completely think you're right? How do you flip someone over to the other side? I mean, that's.
I regularly meet people who, and often I get asked, and this is why people invite me often into coaching, is, I'm not having the impact I'm trying to have. And quite often, if the person hiring me, the leader hiring me, will say, I feel I'm being really clear. I know what I want. I know what I need. How do I get them to do it? The team or whoever it is. Or they'll be frustrated at the fact that they have a very clear idea and nobody's agreeing with them. Why isn't my idea is the best idea? I'm the CEO, or I'm the senior leader, and I've got all this experience. So how come they're not listening to me? Of course they should. And my first question is, if you're not having the impact that you'd like to have, then there's something missing. Let's acknowledge that. And you can, even if you think you have the right answer, there's an opportunity in that gap between what you want to have happen and what's happening. And let's explore the opportunity. That's where I always start. If you're not having the impact, let's look at what might be missing. And 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, what's missing is the person who believes they're right, who's holding on to that view so strongly, is not taking account of the other person's interests or motivations or drivers to agree with them. They're just not interested in the other person. They just want to have what they want to have happen. It's a one-way conversation, and conversation is never one way. I always say, if you think you're right and you're telling somebody else, don't call it what to do. It's not a conversation, it's an instruction.
And is that your advice then? Is that your advice to leaders then on how to negotiate? So we're talking about employees, managers, customers, stakeholders, suppliers,
right?
You name it. You know, what's your advice to them then in that negotiation process with actually a multitude of different people from different? So what's your advice?
Very simple, Ninder, and I'm pretty straightforward on it. You need to get out of your own head and into the head of the other person. It always starts with, what's the other person's interests, motivations, reason why they should listen to me? And if I can't answer that, then I don't understand their world, and therefore they will never really listen to me, because I'm not speaking to why they should be bothered to help me or support me or agree with me. So get out of your head, learn the other person's interests and motivations. Ask yourself, why would they be interested in this that I'm offering or asking for? And start there. That way you can hook what you need into what they will also get and create a win-win.
Interesting. A lot of time, again, back to preparation again, isn't it?
And you need to take the time to prepare that. I mean, you think about how much you would do for somebody that you know and therefore potentially trust. So the more we know somebody, the more we can trust them, right? And the more we're likely to do for that person. So learning people, learning what drives them, helps us to build that trusting relationship. And then we're going to get much more out of that relationship than if we just go in with an ask. We don't know them, we maybe don't even care to know them, but we expect them to do what they're told. It's a difference.
You talk about, and I suppose it's down to negotiation, Pro. You talk about 8 dysfunctional beliefs in leadership. We won't go through all 8. Just pick the 3 top ones. I mean, you've started to hint already, you know, lack of empathy, negotiation. So give me 3 that you find when all your research and all your coaching, sitting with sports people, leaders, coaches. What are the 3 things that typically they just get wrong? Leaders.
Well, those dysfunctional beliefs came from my experiences of working with leaders over a long time and observing leaders, that these were the 8 typical patterns that kept coming up for leaders who were getting stuck. And when I worked to ask them about what was happening, these were the beliefs that were getting in their way. One of them that comes up most often is, well, I've been doing this a long time. I've been a leader for a very long time, so I must be a good leader. You know, time is my educator. I've done it for 30 years. And my challenge with that is, you could have been doing the most ineffective things for 30 years. You could have played football for 30 years, doesn't make you a great footballer. You could have been leading for 30 years, doesn't mean you're an effective leader. And the importance of time is not about the passage of time, but what you do with it. So, you know, what kind of self-development have you done? What kind of feedback have you taken? What kind of mentoring or coaching have you used to improve your leadership? Have you looked at different styles of leadership for the different teams? So that's one. You know, time is not the teacher of leadership. The second one that comes up quite often is this idea that, well, I've got the title, I am the leader, they should just do what I'm telling them to. You know, why else was I given the job? Aren't they supposed to just do it? I've got the mandate and the power. It's back to this command and control. Probably, and I'll say to the leaders who have that belief, you know, you'll probably get some effect by just telling them what to do because you've got the power, and they may fear you firing them or giving them negative reviews, but it'll have a short-term effect and it will demoralize the team over time, and they will probably leave. So you'll end up alone. The far more effective way is to think about, rather than telling people what to do because you have the mandate, inviting them to work with you to create a collaborative environment in your team. So you're not entitled to be a leader. You are a leader, and I believe it to be a privilege. And when you start treating leadership as a privilege, you start to behave in a different way. So that's the second belief I find comes up over and over.
we haven't got time, but that sort of links to servant leadership.
I didn't give you the third one, but it's exactly that.
No,
It's
go on.
around that
Well,
the third one that always springs to mind is this idea that I've read loads of books, including mine, or I've been on training programs. So that's it. As long as I can say I've done that training, then that must mean I'm a good leader. And my view always is, and why my book is so practical and simple, it's not at all rocket science what I talk about, is because it's about the practice, the art of practice. And why I love working with athletes and sport teams is because they understand the need to train to be better. And so I say the same to leaders. You might read the book, you might have attended the program, but you're not training those muscles, getting feedback, and then adapting. You're not a better leader just for having attended the course or read the book.
Yeah, it's the same as when people say, I've got all these initials after my name.
Right.
So they're pointing to their IQ. Look how clever I am. That makes me better qualified, IQ, as opposed to EQ. And that causes a few problems. A couple of things then, and before we wrap up, it's been a testing 18 months. Mm. And it's been a testing 18 months globally for everybody. No one's exempt from this. People in leadership positions had to really adapt very quickly. Right. They couldn't use the body language, the B. They were picking up the C a lot, conversations. Obviously, mental health becomes an issue, so suddenly empathy becomes important. You can't really direct people as much as you used to. Now it's about coaching. How was your day today? Have we got things done? And with hybrid working potentially here to stay, what should leaders now be thinking about in terms of maintaining that leadership of either even small organizations or big ones in this new world now? Picking up everything you said. I mean, the one thing I wouldn't say is become a criminal, but apart from that one, what else? I mean, what other things would you recommend somebody now in this new world in terms of managing their people?
It's been a really tough period, and I've worked with a lot of leaders who have been trying to manage all of those challenges you described, working remotely, parts of the team here, part elsewhere, working through the screen, people being very stressed and unwell, physically and mentally unwell, and them having to learn skills for how you work with people who are showing very different types of stress than we've seen before. And what I say to leaders there's a lot to deal with. So the first thing to do always is look after yourself. First, put your mask on yourself as a leader, because if you are stressed yourself, struggling yourself, overwhelmed yourself, then it's going to be very hard for you to give the care and attention required to your team. And I think, that's important for leaders to show up as good role models to their team for what they want their teams to do. So look after yourself, have good routines, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And then when it comes to leading your organization, I think what it's really asking of us now, post-COVID or in the transition to whatever the new world order is going to be, is it's not enough to know the job and to know the business and expect people to perform, even if they were so before. Now we really need to reach out and connect at a very human level, and that means learning your people. So if I ask them to do anything, I always say to leaders, if you only can tell me who your people are by the tasks that they do or the titles that they have, you don't know them. Get to know your people. I want you to know them so that you can actually take care of all of what they bring to work, which is, stresses that might be going on at home with their partners or with their children or other aspects of their lives. We don't need to know everything, but we need to have empathy for the fact that the person turning up to work is more than their task and their title. So show some interest in the rest of their lives and what they're bringing to work apart from just that.
Very quick nuance. I wasn't going to ask you this question, but I'm going to now. You can get, though, as a leader, too close to your people, so that it becomes difficult to have that awkward conversation. You can, can't you? And it's
Absolutely.
Just finding
that balance. Yeah. And I would say, in that respect, it's about being open enough to show interest. How are you? How was your weekend? How are the family? And letting the other person lead you to how deep they want to go, how much they want you to know. What we find is if you have developed a trusting relationship, you're the kind of leader where you are consistent and reliable and visible and present, and you have an engaged way of working, then people will want to share what's going on with their lives with you. You won't have to go deep. You won't have to pull. It will come to you. People will want to come and tell you, do you mind? I've had a really tough day at home yesterday, and it's impacting the way I work today. So build trust, build empathy, have compassion as a leader, and it will follow.
A couple of the observations some entrepreneurs have said to me during COVID. One was, he said he became a psychologist rather.
Right.
And he said, I was dealing more with people's home problems because they were pouring it out. So he said it was something he'd never done before, and he had to adapt. The second example I had was in the UK, we had a system of furlough.
Yeah.
And he said, choosing who to put on furlough, how to react from the ones who were put on furlough thinking we're not this important, then putting people who weren't on furlough into work saying, I'm working 9-10 hours while Mr. X and Mr. B are sitting at home, sitting in the garden. And they said, finding those two extremes and somehow maintaining that team, they said was very, very challenging, because you didn't know how people would spin to being either on furlough or not on furlough. And of course, the other one about being forced to develop an empathetic, EQ-based coaching style when they've never had to, was a big, huge challenge for them. And they said we were suddenly dealing with things that had nothing to do with the business.
It's interesting, Ninder, to that point, there's so much that we had to learn. I've seen that same challenge, how we manage the furloughed people versus those who are working. And we should, and I've certainly said to leaders, don't assume that the ones who are furloughed are having a great time. They probably would have wanted, so many of them would have been happy to work. And the ones who are working, maybe some of them would have had some relief by not having to work. So there's a lot, we need to be very mindful of assumptions that this is the way people would like to have it. But the other part of it is, if we take it all away, all these challenges of learning EQ and etc., and bring it down to one thing that we all, most of us, the majority of us have, is empathy. We have it at home with our families, with our loved ones, with our friends when they're in need. And I always say to leaders, just remember that you're showing these same skills in other parts of your life. Just bring them to work. Don't assume that you don't need to show up in the same way at work when somebody's struggling as you would if they were a friend at home. So if you would be showing empathy at home or with a close friend, you can show empathy at work. It doesn't mean you need to be their friend at work. It doesn't mean that you need to go all in and give them a hug. Quite often that's inappropriate. But to show that concern for somebody else in the work environment, for something beyond just the task they do for you or the job that they have. It's as human as we can be. You don't need training in it, I would hope.
We've run out of time, so I'm going to ask people to buy the book and read something about the ladder inference, which we just haven't got time. But I've got one last question, really. Looking for the next 3 years, and you don't have to give 3, but if you were to give up to 3 tips now for leaders as your last takeaway, and said, right, this is where we are today, and we're sitting in August. My 3 tips for you, leader, for you to still be where you are in 3 years' time, you must do the next 3 things. If you stick to these 3 things, you'll have done a good job. What were those 3 things? I know you talk about empathy and things, but what would be those 3 things?
I'm going to go straight to my model, because my model is all about the ability to create meaningful connections through persuasion, influence, and negotiation. That's PIN. Right? Those are the skills we're using to connect with people. And the 3 things I say, that if you do these 3 things, just to move the needle 1% in these 3 areas, you will build more meaningful connections that can develop sustainable relationships. And that is to prepare your approach when you're having meetings or conversations or interactions, to be conscious of your body language and your behavior, and to plan the conversation you're going to have. Whether it's at work, whether it's in a regular business as usual environment or in huge changes and stresses, those 3 things will be the conduits, will be the enablers of you building the relationships that will help you manage whatever it is you're facing.
And it's as simple as that.
And it's as simple as ABC, Ninder. Yeah.
Well, look, yes, say busy. Look, it's a great book. It's a
Thank
great
you.
book.
I appreciate you buying it.
It's a pin code, unlocking the key to winning relationships. And nobody can operate on an island. To get anywhere in life, whether it's business or personal, involves other people, and managing those relationships and making sure they're winning relationship requires preparation, requires meticulous planning, and having a high level of awareness is what I think I'm hearing from you.
Absolutely.
So it's a great book. I bought it on Amazon, so it's fully available on Amazon. Well, look, it's now 3:00 in the UK, so 4:00 Norway time.
That's right.
The sun is shining. I'm assuming that's the case there, hopefully.
It's just completely clouded over with rain and greyness. I won't even show you, but it's quite the opposite. So, yeah, we're heading into the weekend with a bit of rain.
It's not very often I get a chance to say our weather's bad.
No.
Of course, you would know that having come from the UK. Well, look, have a great weekend. Thanks for sparing the time. It's a fascinating read, and sometimes you can learn a lot from people who do the wrong things, but if you can use those techniques and do the right things, I think we can all benefit. Thank you very much.
Love that conversation, Ninder, and great to speak to you. Thank you so much for having me.
And have a great weekend.
You too. Have a great weekend. See you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.